So I was asked to speak about fruit pest management and in 30 minutes. So we're not going to be covering a whole lot. And also I decided to focus on pest of tree fruits. So what we're going to look at is some examples of apple and pear and peach nectarine and then cherry. And I'm going to make a PDF of these slides and get it up on the Urban and Small Farms website so that you guys can access this material, because there are going to be some slides that have tables of pesticide recommendations that you won't have time to write down. So just know that you'll have access to these slides. Before I get started though, for any of you folks that are commercial producers, all the content that you want to know about tree fruits and also any spray recommendations are found on this website, intermountainfruit.org. It's written by several different authors from USU and from neighboring states. And you can download a PDF, or this website is basically a web version of the book. But there is a link on the website called Spray Tables, where you can look up or get tables on specific crops and specific pests, or we have a search engine. So you can put in the crop name, pest name, if you want organic only, and then get the results that way. So all this info is available for you guys. So we'll get started with some pest examples of apple and pear. And again, here's a slide that you won't have time to write everything down, but there's a lot of different pests on these hosts. And I would like to cover a couple of the major ones, codling moth and fire blight, and also woolly apple aphid. So with codling moth, this is the primary pest of apple and pear, and the larvae preferentially want to feed on the seeds. So they're just tunneling their way into the fruit to get those seeds, and then they'll exit back out once they're mature. Typically, the larvae start hatching around 3 weeks after bloom. This is just a general estimation, and that's when management starts. But the pest activity continues throughout the summer. So it's not just a one and done treatment. So just quickly about the life cycle. So this insect overwinters in protected areas as a larva, and then it will pupate in the spring. And those protected areas could be around the tree, could be in ground cover, anywhere where there's nice and sheltered areas, but not necessarily in the tree. So in the spring, those moths will emerge, and this is what they look like. The males and females will mate, and then the females lay eggs on the fruit, or she can lay eggs on leaves near the fruit. And then the eggs hatch, and those little larvae with a dark colored head, they will crawl their way to the fruit and then tunnel in. So they'll feed inside the fruit and develop to a mature larva. And once that larva is mature, it exits the fruit and looks for a protected place to pupate. And this cycle of egg to an adult repeats about anywhere from 4 times in immediate southern Utah to 2.5 times northern Utah. So that's why I was saying this is around to be managed all season long. So what to look for if a fruit is infested is the frass, which is the excrement of the larvae as they feed. They push it out of the fruit, and that will be seen on the outside. So this picture on the top left is showing the frass coming out of the calyx end, the flower end. And sometimes that's hard to identify when you're looking at fruits to see if some have been infested, because as you know, that blossom end of the fruit has a little bit of brown papery calyces left over, and that looks similar to this frass, but the frass will be darker in color. You could find the exit hole or the holes where the frass is coming out, where leaves are touching the fruit or where fruit is touching each other. Those are places where the larvae are protected. It can get into the fruit easily. So for managing codling moth, there's a few non-chemical options. One is to thin the apple fruits to 1 per cluster. And just as I mentioned, a lot of times the larvae are entering fruits where they're touching each other. So if you can give that space between fruits, that will help a little bit. And as the fruits drop from the tree, well, as the fruits become infested with the larva, they may drop from the tree. And so if you can clean up those drop fruits in a timely manner, then you're helping to slowly reduce the population. And then finally, if you do have apple trees or even crab apples that have a decent size apple, consider, and you don't manage them, you don't even pick the fruit, consider replacing them with a different tree, because that is contributing to the buildup of the moth population for your neighbors or for commercial producers. And then often it's a pest that does need to be treated. So at Utah State University, we do provide newsletters via email that give dates for different locations on when to treat, or you can go and look up this information yourself. So we have this website, it's climate.usu.edu/traps. So it's with the Utah Climate Center. And the page opens to a map where you can select a location closest to you. And then on the right side of the page, you can select a pest that you want to find more information about. So in this case, I selected Kaysville, and I'm going to click on one of the codling moth choices, and then I get a results table. So let's just pretend that today is May 22nd, 2022, and we're looking at this table, and we can see that there is a orange check mark in a couple of the rows. And that tells us something. So if I were to click on one of those rows, May 26th, this tells me, oh, okay, egg hatch is going to begin for codling moth, and I need to start making my application. So this is the exact same information that we give in our newsletters over the course of the summer. Here you can just find it yourself on the website. Now here's where I have these tables of products that will be available to you on the Urban and Small Farms website that has all the resources for this conference. One thing I just want to comment on for this table is that there's a column called the PHI, so that's pre-harvest interval, and it's listed in days. And so if you're needing to make a spray somewhat close to harvest, you want to pick a product that has a lower number so that you don't have to wait so long until you can harvest the fruit. So the other comment is that a lot of these pesticides have restrictions like 1 application only, or not for use on pears. So you want to pay attention to that as well. So in the handout, I have tables for folks who are commercial growers growing conventionally or organic, and that's shown here. And then I'll have tables that are for, if there's any backyard folks here that are growing conventionally, meaning non-organic. And this table lists from most effective to least effective. And then also a table for backyard that want to be organic. And again, this is most effective to least effective. All right, completely non-chemical option for codling moth is bagging the fruit. And so there's a couple of options. You can use some bags that you can find online, like Japanese 2-ply bags. Wax paper bags, you can get at Amazon for a pretty decent price and a large quantity. And there are some other options as well. So the bags are applied at thinning time. So when the fruit's about a 1/2 inch diameter, and then any fruit that you don't bag, remove from the tree. And then you can just leave them all summer long, and they may need to be removed a few weeks before harvest to get nice coloration. Just one comment, the picture on the lower left, there's some information online about using these nylon socks for colony moth, and they're actually not quite as effective. They can still lay their eggs through the teeny tiny little holes of the nylon. So I wanted to include woolly apple aphid because this pest is becoming more and more common in small farms and hobby orchards than it ever has in the past. Usually we only see it on commercial farms here and there, but it seems to be becoming more of an issue. So it's not your typical aphid. It feeds more on woody parts of the plant, and it produces this cottony covering that makes it almost impermeable to an insecticide spray. It, as it feeds, it can create these little galls on the twigs. But if you see woolly apple aphid in the canopy of the tree, you know 100% that it's also on the roots. So it occurs in 2 different places, the roots and the canopy. And the issue with that is that it's feeding on the roots and causing these galls, and thus reducing the flow of water and nutrients up and down the tree, and leading to a little bit of loss of vigor and decline. Towards the end of the season, when these populations really get going, that's when most people are wondering, what is this in my tree? And that's a little too late to do anything about. But they're very sticky. It makes it, not fun to harvest the fruit when you have to work your way through these cottony colonies. So for management, it's important to look for the aphids once they start building up in population. And it's later than most of our aphids, which we really see as soon as those buds emerge. With the woolly apple aphid, we don't really start to see it until mid to late May. And you want to look in various places on the tree that create cracks and crevices. So old pruning cuts, they might be right around the edges of those cuts. They might be in a little crotch of 2 twigs or branches, or they may be at the base of new shoots coming out of the tree. So again, all these little cracks and crevices are where those colonies are going to start to build. And that's the time when you really want to target them. So you would want to use an insecticide mixed with oil. Horticultural oil will help that insecticide penetrate into the colony. So organic, it could be insecticidal soap plus oil, and then conventional options, on a pyrethroid plus oil. Okay, so the third pest of apples is fire blight, and this is caused by a bacterium, Coryneum. The name came about because on pears, it just turns the tissue black. So it looks like it's been burned by fire. And the picture on the left is the damage on apple. So it's a disease of blooming flowers, but it can affect all parts of the tree. So it overwinters. It's what's called a canker, where the bacteria has killed the tissue. And in spring, that bacteria in that canker starts to ooze. And a single canker on a decent sized limb can create enough bacteria to infest blooms on apple, crabapple, pear trees in a 1 acre area. So it's another one that if you leave it, don't manage it on your own trees, it can affect other trees in the area. So that bacteria that's oozing from those cankers then is spread by insects, wind, and rain to open flowers. And again, it's the open flowers in which we see infections. So clusters under bad conditions, plus a lot of clusters on the tree, can become infected. and the bacteria can continue moving within the tree. So moves right under the bark in the phloem area out to shoots, creating these wilted shoots. And there's a little bit of bacterial ooze, a little bit of orange ooze right there. And it can also move into the trunk of the tree or the large scaffold limbs. So on this large limb, I have scraped off the bark, and you can see basically what the bacteria is doing. It's killing the tissue right underneath. So obviously there's no movement of water or nutrients in that area. So to manage fire blight, it's kind of a multi-pronged process. When you're pruning your trees in the winter, and now's a great time to be pruning apples, maybe not in the snow, but this time of year, you want to look for those cankers from the fire blight. So you may find some branches that have, on the left picture, dark discolored bark. In the middle picture, you may find some areas where the bark is actually sunken in. So those are two indications of the canker that you would want to prune out. Or you may find some little twigs amongst the tree where the leaves are still attached, shown on the right. And that's another indication that that's an old fire blight killed twig. So with this time of pruning in the winter, you want to take out the tissue 8 to 10 inches below that visible area of infection. And because you're pruning in the winter, the bacteria is not active, so you do not need to sterilize your pruning tools in between cuts. And the other part of the management approach is applying something to the tree. So you could just do your copper spray, which would be applied when the buds start to swell. And the idea is that, remember I showed you the picture of the canker that was oozing that bacteria? Well, the copper, when it's applied, will kind of prevent the bacteria from continuing to multiply. So it doesn't really kill it. It just stops that multiplication and thus slows the spread. So you want to get good coverage with the copper. But if trees are, being infected year after year, you may want to consider a bloom time spray to take care of the Coryneum that has landed in the flowers. So you would only want to do this during bloom, okay, and also under warm, wet conditions. That is when infections would happen. So if you needed to put an application on, there's an antibiotic called streptomycin. And if no one here is from Utah County, you're fine to use streptomycin. In Utah County, there is a little bit of resistance, so you'd want to use something different. If you wanted to go organic, there are some options for you. Serenade, shown on the lower left there, is an option that you can actually get at any garden center. So any hobbyist backyard grower could use it. But the Blossom Protect I've listed there is only sold in quantities really for commercial producers, and it can be quite expensive. All right, so moving on to peach nectarine. Again, we have a list of our major, moderate, and minor pests. This list is a little smaller than that for apple. And I'm going to talk about greater peach tree borer and Coryneum blight. So greater peach tree borer it's a clearwing moth, and it attacks the lower trunk of not just peach nectarine, but also apricot and plum. And the problem is on the younger trees, it can actually kill them. So when you're putting in a brand new orchard or some brand new trees, they can be susceptible or at risk of being attacked. So the larvae spend the winter within the tree, and then in spring, the sap starts to flow, and the peach trees and any tree affected tries to push out the larvae by producing a lot of gum. And the gumming will be mixed with a little bit of frass. So it's kind of crumbly when it dries, but very, very gummy initially. So the eventually, though, the larvae will pupate to an adult, and they emerge from the trees towards mid-June in northern Utah and about 3 weeks earlier in southern Utah. And then they'll mate and lay their eggs all season long. So it's just one generation, but you have this continuous cycle or continuous emergence of moths laying eggs through September. So some trees can actually have several larvae within the trees themselves. For management, this picture on the right is what you do not want to have happen. You want to remove the weeds and turf and other ground covers from around the base of the tree, because that makes for a really nice environment for the moths to lay their eggs if they have that protection of the turf. So keep that area around the trunk of the tree clean. You could consider painting the lower part of the trunk with white 50% latex paint. And the purpose of that is just to create a smooth surface. Again, kind of reducing the preference for laying eggs. But if you wanted to spray, that is going to probably be your most effective option. And you really only need to cover the lower 12 inches of the tree, and so all around and any exposed roots. And so it takes 30 seconds to spray one tree or less. And you will start your first application, like I said, in around late June for northern Utah, 3 weeks earlier, southern Utah. Repeat monthly, and then with your last application in September. All right, and then Coryneum blight is a fungal disease of, again, not just peach nectarine, but apricot, sometimes plum, sometimes cherry. And so it's a fungus. Infections can occur actually in fall, spring, and summer. And in fall, what happens is once those leaves drop, you have this nice fresh wound, that leaf scar, and that's where the fungi in the fall will land and create an infection, and it will grow a little bit around that bud, kill the bud, and create spores the following spring that affect the new foliage as it emerges. So with that new foliage, you get little tiny leaf spots, and they'll drop out, leaving this hole. And so that's what gives this disease its alternate name, which is shoffle. So Coryneum blight or shoffle are the same thing. But mostly we care about the fruit becoming infected. With early season infections, they'll look like this with the purplish spots. And then as the fruit ages, those spots will become scabby. And sometimes if the infections weren't too bad, it won't be really that noticeable on the ripened fruit. But if infections happen later in the season, and as I mentioned, they can occur all season long, especially under heavy rains, these later infections can be more problematic because the fruit is not marketable and it's actually not even edible. It becomes a little bit more soft. So that's where you want to avoid. So with management, we talked about copper for fire blight. Copper is also a good option for this disease. The application would be in the fall, and it would be to cover those fresh leaf scars to prevent those new infections. And then in spring, that application could be at petal fall to prevent a lot of infections on the foliage. And then throughout the season, there may need to be an additional fungicide application when we have rainy conditions, meaning 4 hours of rainfall. So some options are provided here for commercial producers and backyard producers. And unfortunately, there's really no good organic options for this disease. So I'm going to finish up with this last pest, and we'll talk about cherry. So you can see the list of pests goes down even further when we go to cherry. But the Western cherry fruit fly is the major pest of cherry and the one that can be more difficult to manage. So it's a maggot that feeds in the flesh of the fruit. It's the primary pest of tart and sweet cherries. In fact, almost anyone in Utah who grows one of these trees can have cherries that become attacked. So it's a maggot, meaning the adult is a fly. So it overwinters in the soil as a pupa, and then the pupa emerges into a fly, and they come up from the soil and they lay eggs under the skin of the fruit. So when you're looking at a cherry, sometimes it's hard to tell if it's infested. This picture on the left, of course, there's a maggot on the outside and there's a hole we can see. But if we were looking on the other side of the fruit, you may not even, the fruit still looks plump, it still looks good. You may not know until you open it up and see the inner flesh is just black. So they don't really, when their maggots are young, cause the fruit to really degrade too bad. So that's why the timing of the treatment is important. Make sure that you wait until the fruit turns the salmon blush color. The flies cannot lay their eggs. They cannot penetrate the skin of the cherries to lay their eggs until it gets soft enough. So it's that salmon blush color. And you would never want to spray the cherry trees when all the cherries are green. That would be a wasted spray. So just quickly, a few non-chemical options. You could put a tarp under the tree for a couple of weeks before harvest. And the idea there is you can see the maggots on the left coming out of the fruit. They just drop straight down to the ground. So if there's a tarp there, they're going to drop onto the tarp. And every few days, you'll want to remove the tarp, shake it out into a trash can and put it back down. And so over several years, you're just gradually reducing the population. Removing the drop fruit, because there may be some maggots within. Removing unharvested fruit from the tree is also, it's hard to do. Sometimes you have these tall trees, but if you can, it would be best, because the flies will be laying eggs in the fruit through October, so well beyond harvest. And some people have gone to extremes and they actually net their entire tree. So if it's small enough, that is something you can consider. Just be sure and make sure you have that tight enclosure around the trunk of the tree, because the flies, again, they come up from the ground. And if the net's hanging down, they can just go right to the fruit. So here are a couple more tables. Again, you'll have these available on the Urban and Small Farms website. And I've listed here products for commercial growers, for you guys that might be on this Zoom right now, and then those that are backyard or hobby growers. So these are conventional options. And one thing you'll notice as you look at these tables is a lot of times the products are repeated. So you can often get one for multiple pests, and then organic options. So I am going to end there, and I'll pull up my email for you, and then we can also ask or answer some questions.
All right, thank you, Mair. Okay, we have a couple questions in just a couple of minutes to go over a couple. So this first one, I believe, has to do with fire blight. Would keeping the leaves still be a sign of fire blight in a year like this, where a lot of trees kept their leaves past the fall or through the winter?
Yeah, so that was a different circumstance where we had just an incredible cold snap that kind of just made the leaves not have that natural tendency to drop. So with leaves that remain attached with fire blight, it's more scattered in the tree, where you have a tree, it's mostly bare, but then you'll see a few twigs here and there with a few leaves on them.
Okay, and two more questions as of right now is, do tree wasps encourage greater peach twig borer?
Do tree wasps increase?
Or encourage?
Encourage. I mean, the answer would be no. I'm going to read it. Do tree wasps encourage? Yeah, so tree wasps, like if you're thinking of paper wasps or anything like that, have really no.
I think it's tree rat.
Oh,
wrapped. I saw wasp. Sorry.
yeah, and I heard Ben say,
Wraps. That's
okay.
a lot more sense.
All right, that's a great
Sorry.
question, actually. Tree wraps, like the people put white tree wrap for preventing sun scald. If you were to leave that white tree wrap on the tree through the summer, yes, it could be a wasp or the greater peat tree borer could get in there, nice environment, and lay their eggs. So those tree wraps, you want to make sure and remove them by towards the end of March, they can be removed. Okay.
Oh, good question. Then another one is, do chemicals have an expiration date? So this is for more of a backyard grower where they bought a chemical, it's going to last them several years. Does it have an expiration date?
So they often don't have a specific expiration date unless it's a, some of the organics that are made from biologicals like bacteria do, but others don't. And they can often last, 5, 8 years. But if you have a question about it, I'd recommend that you go to the manufacturer's website and they have a chat or email function. Just let them know the product when you bought it if you're not entirely sure.
Okay. And then there's one more question. I'll let, if you want to read that one and answer that one.
Yeah. Okay. So Carrie asked, do I have experience with using this product called Agrifage for fire blight? And yes, Carrie, we actually did use, we did a trial for a couple of years and we did use Agrifage in that trial. And unfortunately, it was not as effective as some of the other options. Like we're talking organic, the Blossom Protect was more effective. So Carrie, we can talk more about that if you'd like. You can shoot me an email.